Thank you very much, Dee, Penny, the law faculty, for hosting this launch. I appreciate it very much. I can't say that I look back with great fondness to my days in the law faculty here, but I was here. So I've got some sort of memories of the place, and I think you're changing it for the good. There were some very good things in the law faculty then, but I'm not sentimental about my time when I was there. I don't look back on it as being spectacularly interesting. But I hear it's very different now. This book is about a journey. It wasn't something automatic in my genes that led me to get involved in the struggle and land in jail, survive, come out on the other side and cause more trouble, get back to jail and things like that, come out again, find, surprisingly, that what we had fought for was being subverted and was necessary to cause more problems again for the powers that be. I'm presenting memoirs of the prison and other aspects of the opportunity I had to play a role in the struggle, for which I'm proud. I'm proud of this, but I think it's also necessary to have humility. We've got a lot of people who flaunt their struggle credentials and conduct themselves in a way that is disparaging of other people. I think it's very important to be sensitive to the fact that if you have a reputation through having been in the struggle and conducted oneself in a way that you are has earned you some sort of reputation, that reputation has to be re-earned by your conduct every day of your life. It's not something given for all time, no matter what you do. It's important not to have complacency and arrogance. Now, it's tempting to speak about the present, which is discussed in the introduction to my book about life outside the ANC, but I think it's important to give something of the experience, because a lot of people didn't read, or most people didn't read the original book. This is not an academic book, which I'm presenting, hoping to get accreditation and all of that. It's not an academic book, but it's also not illogical. I write this as a freedom fighter. It's a word that evokes scorn and ridicule in the eyes of many because of the conduct of some people. But we have to reclaim those words and resurrect a desire for people to emulate the great freedom fighters of our history. And what I mean by being a freedom fighter is to identify one's life and, in fact, to offer one's life in the service of the oppressed people of this country, to embody their suffering in your own identity and being. Now, that's not something that comes naturally merely by making a declaration. One must prepare oneself for it. One can say, I am prepared to do this and that. But a lot of people who went into work underground from outside, from white people like me, people who went in from outside, came back to London because they hadn't actually prepared for it. I had to prepare myself for the hardships of underground, because prison alone is not hard. Possibility of arrest, torture, long imprisonment, rearrest, all these things, and death. And I think Mandela says, if you say you are prepared to die, you must know what that means. You must prepare yourself for it, so that when the moment comes, when you face that possibility, you do not shrink from what is entailed. So I place a lot of weight on making choices and preparing to act them out. And in that sense, I'm not setting myself up as totally exceptional from everyone else in this room, because we all face difficult choices in our lives. And we know very often that they're going to happen, and we have to prepare ourselves to act in a way that is the one that we consider correct. Freedom and imprisonment sound totally incompatible words. But one of the things I try to show is that even as a prisoner, you actually are an active agent under very difficult, you can be an active agent under very difficult conditions, even under torture, because you have information that only you can release or not release. So what I'm saying then, when I spoke of preparation, if one has doubt, one mustn't embark on this type of action. You're actually doing a disservice to yourself and to others if you have doubt and you do not prepare yourself adequately for what you are going to encounter. So this book is about a journey. It's not something that I was born to do. I describe in the book how I gradually developed a consciousness, first a liberal consciousness, and then a more politically radical consciousness without having contempt for liberalism. The same reasons why I became a liberal, ethically, were the reasons why I became ANC cadre and a communist. And the same reasons why I joined were the reasons why I left. When I found that the connection, the embodiment of the pain of the oppressed was no longer respected by the liberation movement to which I had subscribed. And that is where I think I will leave it by way of introduction. The rest can be in conversation. I didn't think that I would be here. Just as a matter of fact, I had life insurance. My father had taken out for me when I was born, and I was running out of money, and I just cashed it for like 2,000 rands or something, because I didn't think I would actually be around. It was a time of insurrection in the 80s, and I was very single-minded. But as regards Ahmed Timol, when I was working underground in Durban for a very short while, he was killed. And I saw what he was doing from the inquest. And it was very clear he's doing what I was going to do, so that the same thing could happen to me as happened to him. Also, something I didn't realize till the inquest, one of the torturers is a Brigadier Gloy. When I was convicted, after conviction, I was actually interrogated again. I'd never heard of that happening. And one of the interrogators was Spyker van Wyk, very notorious torturer here, and the other is Gloy, who's mentioned in the Timol inquest. So it could very well happen, when they apply electric shocks and such things, they can do it a little bit longer than they're supposed to, and they kill you. So it can happen unintentionally, but it can also happen because they are frustrated that they're not getting the information that they want. So I also thought at the time, at later periods when they assassinated David Webster, for example, and others, a lot of people who were under house arrest were assassinated. And I had to go initially to the police station twice a day and then back to my house. And they knew you're going to certain places. So you are actually an easy target unless you have a range of ways of getting to the place. So I tried to avoid it because it was a real possibility. Again, even after, well, in the 1990s, after unbanning, ANC did feel that they needed to take extra security for us.
Earlier you spoke about the agency that a prisoner has, even under very difficult circumstances, because they have the information. So in a way, it's something that you can trade. And in the book, you illustrate different ways in which you used this in order to protect other people that you're working with, or to, but also to give yourself some time to respond. And yet I'm struck by the fact that you also say in the book that when you had an opportunity, when you visited Dr. Buchan, for example, you didn't talk about your torture, despite the fact that you had taken notes of the bruises, or even later, you didn't actually speak about the torture and have conversations with the lawyers. I'm wondering what went into that choice of repressing one of the most important and damaging experiences.
Well, even though I did not comply with what the security police had done, I didn't want to be tortured again. And when I went to see the district surgeon, waiting there was Colonel Steenkamp, later General Steenkamp. And when he got angry, his lip used to quiver. And I was intimidated. And when I went to see the doctor, and he saw all these bruises and cuts and all of this, I thought it's obvious what's happened. And I just didn't say it because I was not sufficiently confident of my rights, or let's say, I wasn't confident that my rights would be sufficient to protect me from further torture. There'd been like 3 days since they'd stopped torturing me. I didn't want it to start again. So I was scared. And I saw him give the report to the head of the security police. So in some sense, it vindicated the sense that I had that if I were to have spoken then, it would have given me trouble. With my lawyers, when I met the lawyers, I said to them, I've been tortured, I want to raise this in court. And they said to me, their advice to me was that there had been a case where Sean Hosey was in jail with me, had been tortured, and because he didn't give evidence in the box, I gave a statement from the doc, and couldn't be cross-examined, and he also didn't have witnesses. They had all the witnesses. It was discredited. And when you are facing two very seasoned lawyers, it's very hard to argue for it. But I think, in retrospect, that they were wrong, that I would have been believed, because a lot of people did come to hear of it. And secondly, about 20 years later, 1997 or so, Colonel Taylor, one of the torturers, actually applied for amnesty, including for torturing me. And he died before it could be heard. I was going to oppose it because he didn't tell the truth. But if I can go on about agency, I'm not only talking about agency in the context of torture. When you're in prison, You imagine, in Afrikaans, they refer to the prisoners as eenhede, units, not human beings. And they say that until you have a number, you are nothing. Now, that wasn't the case with us. Well, when it started, before I got there, it had been very difficult. And the late David Kitson explained that they had tamed the Boers in the sense that things were run. The prisoners actually ran the prison. The only thing we didn't do was lock the doors and count us, and they sometimes got the numbers wrong, even though there were only between 6 and 10 of us. They'd have to recount. And what I mean by us running the prison is that, you know, prisons have a capacity for drama, which the warders don't have. And when I was in the second time, one of these warders said to me, it was the second time I was in a state of emergency, it was with criminal prisoners. He said to me, with them, I just say, fuck off into yourselves. With you, it's the United States, the Supreme Court, and the United Nations. So, you know, you can't do that with me. But also what we did in the first time I was in, and by the way, when I was with others, I lost a lot of courage, although I didn't actually give in to them. I was scared. And because they took me after conviction, I was put in maximum security where the death cells were in isolation for a further 3.5 months. And then I was interrogated by these torturers. They didn't torture me, but they interrogated me. So by the time I reached others, I was quite terrorized. But when I was with them, I learned to demand my rights. You know, they say to you, kom, 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 kom. Now, in Afrikaans, it's much more aggressive than come, come, come. And what we never ran. We always went slowly, and if we had a broom, we dragged the broom along the ground and things like this. Also, we worked in a workshop at our own pace. And we would really, over years, argue over theoretical questions like colonialism of a special type, and this, that, and the other, race and class, and what have you. We were not there for work. And the warders had learnt not to say work more because they didn't want any drama. And on a Friday, we used to clean the passage, and we convinced them that Marley tiles couldn't be polished. So we never polished the floors the whole time I was there. And what we would do is, some people would just lie on their beds. Some would sit together discussing revolutionary literature. We managed to get in, you know, the way the warders censored, they didn't go by author. They went by title. Now, if the author was Lenin, but the book said something like register, it sounded like the Keys Register. So we got this socialist register with Joe Slovo on problems of armed struggle. But, you know, we also thought, we're never going to get this again. So we would write out the whole book. Like Marx's Grundrisse wrote out the whole book because we thought, this is a mistake. We may not get it in again. And then, you know, UNISA Library would send, sometimes there were sympathetic people at UNISA Library. If you requested something, they would then send something similar, because they didn't have the book. So we had a lot of agency. Just the last thing on that is, you know, you can call lawyers when you're a convicted prisoner, not when you're in detention, when you're incommunicado. So we also had this, as the order says, the Supreme Court, United States and the United Nations, You had strange things that happened. Like, for example, you had dogs in the yard at one stage, and you get these neurotic dogs that bark the whole night. And we said, look, can this dog be moved, please? And this captain who was in charge, who was for us as powerful as the Tsar of Iran. So when the Tsar fell, it was to us similar to when Captain Schnabel was removed, It was like similar momentous moment. Now, he said, "Die Hund bly, the dog stays." So we then said, okay, we want a lawyer. And then, you see, they get into trouble because the head office doesn't want lawyers coming in and with these things. So our capacity to drama, even arguments, they don't really want to get into arguments with us because the thing with getting into arguments, they were not supposed to talk politics with us. And we'd get into politics and then try and get them to tell us some news by mistake, because then they got angry.
Okay, I'm going to open to the floor. I want you to give us a bit of texture on the torture, actually. If you want to read something, is that?
I wasn't going to read on that, but I can. I thought I was going to read on underground. Okay, but I can read on torture. The first one is in police hands.
Yeah.
If you want a long, that, okay, or okay.
I'll take a brief one.
Yeah. You see, I was going to, let me just, I think the letter on the smuggled letters. You does not what we agreed.
Okay,
Smuggled
okay.
letter. Smuggled letter.
Wait. You're not going to do the prison thing here and run this. One of the things that is interesting, you were underground for 4 years, from 1971 to 1974. 1975, when you got arrested. That must have been quite a long time. Are you able to read something?
Yes, I can read on that.
Actually? Because I think very few of us have an idea of underground, especially such extended time.
You see, it's very important to talk about underground because you know of people like me who were caught, but there are a lot of people who worked in places that are not on maps for years, and they've not got recognition. And I think you need to understand underground is very difficult, and mine was not the most difficult. This was the start of 4 very lonely years. Struggle is about comradeship, about sharing and cooperation with others, but I was alone. All I had were coded messages received every 6 weeks or so. The liberation was non-racial and fought for an equal society, but I never had the chance to work with black people. Our anthem was Nkosi Sikeleli Africa, but I never sang it until I was in jail with comrades who were on death row in the late 1970s. There was no one with whom I could openly forge links. Known anti-apartheid supporters were banned or in jail. There was no one to say to me, this is a good idea, or that's a bad idea. Do something else. Or if I hit on good ideas, there was no one to say, yes, stick to that. Underground work can take a variety of forms, all of which are very stressful and extract a toll on one's personal life. Everything essential, what one is, what one feels, and what is most significant in one's life must be concealed. You reveal only the inessential in order to safeguard the most meaningful aspects of your being. Working undercover makes it difficult to form or maintain intimate relations. Mine was a very isolated existence. I longed for communications from my contacts in exile. From 1971 to 1975, my underground activities forced me to lead a double life. This was in contrast to the later emergency when I again went underground, when I was also a lecturer. To all my friends, I was an extraordinarily dedicated academic, a workaholic who did not seem to have much else in his life besides academic scholarship. Circumspect during the daytime, I worked secretly at night, laboriously preparing and duplicating pamphlets on a Roneo machine in my home, then posting the pamphlets in post boxes in Durban and Pietermaritzburg. There were not photocopiers or computers in those days. It was very difficult. I can go on, but I think that's enough to give you a sense. You know, the problem with intimate relationships is the most important part of my life I couldn't share with anyone. So that set a limit on any relationship. There were also physical barriers, like, you know, the people who trained me assumed that I would get to Durban, would hire a garage where I'd put all my equipment, and then I'd live a normal life. But I couldn't hire a garage so easily. So I used to keep the material at one stage in the bedroom. And it was quite difficult if you had an intimate relationship, if a person were to go looking around in cupboards and things like that. So it was practically difficult, but it was the main thing. I was scared. You know, at that stage, I was not participating in a lot of things, and I couldn't explain why. You know, Rick Turner was banned, but Rick Turner would break his banning order. I'd meet him at some friend of mine's place, and I thought, oh my God, I'm going to be called as a state witness when Rick Turner is arrested. So I just have to go where I couldn't explain my behavior a lot of the time. That's not related directly to intimate relations, but it gives you an idea of how all the time your life is shaped in various ways. You know, Dennis Davis, I can see, is there, and there is an article of mine he read, and I never directly say that I'm a Marxist, you know. I was like the mayor of Casterbridge in Thomas Hardy's book. I had to argue with one arm behind my back. And I was also very conscious that Roly Orenstein was in Durban, and his daughter was one of my students who would tell Roly what I was saying. Roly was formerly in the Communist Party and so on, and broken away, and that Roly would guess what I was really doing. So that I was having a lot of these things going through my mind when I was even giving lectures in constitutional law, and Rycroft went to. So I've got some of my students who could probably say that whether or not I succeeded in sanitizing what I was doing. Comrade Nyembezi, I've only seen one review this time round, as far as I can see. The previous ones were very encouraging, but I don't know if there's more than one so far. There's one or two in the pipeline, as far as I know, so I don't know. The new edition was very difficult to write, the introduction, because I'm writing with my break from ANC and SACP, and also from close relationships, and one has to be careful. I'm speaking about what I regard as betrayal, and I've got to not appear, or let's say I've got to choose my words very, very carefully, and not be holier than thou, and have the readers understand why I'm saying it. And at the same time, it's personal. Penny Madam Dean's question is very, very interesting to me, because people have got this contempt for liberalism. And in fact, if you have contempt for liberalism, actually, you need to look at the history of the ANC. ANC, early history is like suffused in the liberal influence and the Christian influence, all these things. Which is not to say that I'm become a reborn liberal, but what I'm saying is I'm trying to indicate that whatever your political orientation may be, whether you are a Christian priest, a liberal, a Marxist, communist, a syndicalist, there's a difference between having a set of ideological beliefs and acting on them. What my book is about the unity of understanding, compassion, and passion on which I acted. Now, there are a lot of people who have got more advanced understandings than I've got of Marxism, of liberalism, of constitutionalism, all these things. But they may well treat it as contemplative. Now, I've decided that it was necessary to act it out. So when I say that the same reasons why I joined are the same reasons as why I left, I mean that there's a continuity between being the liberal boy in Cape Town, joining the ANC and Communist Party, and leaving, in that I tried to act in fidelity with my connecting my life, tying my life to that of the oppressed people of South Africa. So I left for the same reasons as I joined, not because it's neoliberalism or anything like this, but because I believe, let us give an example. In voting for Nkandla spending, they diverted funds from the poor. They ruptured the connection between them and their mothers and fathers in many cases, or in the case of white people, those with whom they had chosen to tie their lives. They decided to rupture it. So that's what I mean by that. Hope it's clear. Nolundi, on the constitutional negotiations, I was a bit of a dinosaur. When the constitutional negotiations started, I was an insurrectionist. So I was not happy about talking to the other side. And you'd have ANC people speaking to explain what had been done, and there was different emphases. I appreciate Mandela much more now in 2017 than I did when I worked with him. Because when there was that transition, a lot of things were done in secret, and they may never have succeeded had they not been done in secret. Because you can't have discuss a willingness to talk in a stadium. You have to meet people one-on-one, things like this. Now, people like myself had, the ANC had told us, make South Africa ungovernable, make apartheid unworkable, have organs of people power, then insurrection, and I was very involved in these things. But at the same time, they were having secret talks. At one level, it's almost a lack of good faith in relation to your members. But they couldn't tell them that they were doing this. In order to conduct those talks which made negotiations possible, they had to keep people in the dark. And I don't think they handled it properly, the way in which they came back and entered into negotiations. They went to talks, didn't inform the rest of the leadership, came back and suspended armed action. And, MK was shocked. People a lot of us imagined that the power of MK was greater than it was, and that we lost the opportunity to march on Pretoria. So there was partly illusions, but also there was just this failure to work out mechanisms for taking the constituency adequately with you. So there was a residual militarism amongst the ANC membership. A way they do handle these things is even if even though I was not happy about this, I get visited by City Press and asked to write a defense of the Pretoria Minute. And I think one of the people like Walter Sisulu had put them up to that, see? You were expected, and they knew that because we had a discipline, that we would not break ranks. I've written about this in, you'll see it in the Daily Maverick tomorrow, about dissent, how people like Ruth First disagreed, but she never came out publicly. But they went further. You actually had to defend the position. So on the negotiations and the pushback now, I think people underestimate the importance of peace, that people were being massacred in Boipatong, a lot of other places that we don't know about. And people like Mandela always used to say, we were not dealing with an enemy that was on its knees. And it was very, very important to secure the peace. A lot of things I personally was embarrassed with at the time, I now realize were part of his way of reassuring whites. It was necessary to reassure whites because they had lots of dynamite, they had lots of guns, things like this. This thing of wearing a Springbok rugby jersey, I was embarrassed by at the time. Going to see Betsy Verwoerd, all of these things were really important and calculated actions on his part to preclude a white counter-revolution type thing. As regards whether they sold out and all of this, personally, all negotiations are give and take, and the constitution that we have, its interpretation was not finalized in 1996, and it's not determined by lawyers or the courts alone. If we want that constitution to be better on land rights, we need to put political weight behind that and not rely. If the government is not moving, people in social movements must push them. As regards this claim that there was a secret pact and all this, I was in the leadership. We used to meet every morning at 6 o'clock in town to discuss what would be negotiated. There was no talk of any secret pact. I can see Neil Coleman is here, and he will talk about the IMF. But that IMF deal, I'm not an expert on this, but people like Trevor Manuel claim that they had a loan and they had to give certain standard assurances. They didn't give assurances to the effect that they would privatize and this, that, and the other. But if they did, I know nothing about it. I don't agree with Ronnie Castro saying there was a Faustian pact. If there was a Faustian pact, it was done behind the back of the national executive of the ANC on which I sat. The initiation had to be done in secret for practical reasons.
Okay. In your book, you talk quite a lot about preparation. Preparation for underground, preparation for prison, and even death if it comes to that. And later you talk about the fact that you were a dinosaur and that you were not quite convinced about negotiations. So you didn't necessarily prepare for peace then, and the conditions under which that peace might happen, not as a finished product.
Yeah, well, I also thought, I mean, until very recently, the ANC formulation was that we'd set up a government of state of people's power. And I also envisaged Nuremberg-type trials. And I also had illusions of the power of MK. And I had to console myself just to see them marching when Chris Heine's funeral was very sad. But I didn't myself appreciate that MK was not capable of winning the war. So I didn't prepare for peace, which is not to say that I didn't appreciate the reasoning that the people who were dying were not the whites, not the reactionaries. The people who were dying were random killings in townships and things like this. In Tata, there was a killing just before the election, a whole lot of things like this. So that I came to accept it, but I mean, a lot of us were caught off guard because we were not informed. I mean, the SACP had a program called the Path to Power, which was insurrectionist. Late 1989, the chair of the meeting was Thabo Mbeki, who was at that time carrying out secret talks. So that's how one can say devious it was, but that's how secrecy coexisted. I think they were hedging their bets, because if the talks broke down, they wanted to be able to pick up again and fight.
It's interesting, this notion, and I think it's not only in South African context, and I think it's not only in your story, Raymond, but it's very interesting, this notion of freedom fighter and fighting for liberation and the notion of militancy that doesn't often take on board negotiations and creation of peace as necessarily militant and courageous in and of itself. So there is something that I think we need to think through, particularly now, around certainly how we understand power, how that power is embodied, whether we are conscious of it or not, in very patriarchal terms, and even bravery itself is embodied in those kinds of, I mean, you defined what for you a freedom fighter is, but there are other layers that certainly are emerging in this conversation about the freedom fighter as the one who, and every time you refer to MK, so there's something about the embodiment of what that freedom fighter is, which I think feminists would, or some feminists certainly, would have quite interesting thought processes around that and critique. Cynthia Enloe, whom you read, I mean, would you like to say something about it?
Yeah, well, you know, when I did come to write on the ANC underground and on the Zuma rape trial, I did problematize the military heroism, which tends to be a form of masculinity which is antagonistic to gender equality. Not always, because you had more than one tendency. I mean, you had abusers, but you also had people like Chris Hani introducing new rules which forbade senior officers from having relationships with new recruits until they'd been there for a long time. So I think when I had this idealized view of MK, I was not sufficiently gender conscious at the time, but it's taken me more and more time to understand how deeply imbricated masculinity is in the history of the ANC and also the Communist Party, how very masculinist they are, and that is why they have been prepared to succumb to the leadership of someone like Jacob Zuma, who is a sort of epitome of hyper-patriarchal conduct and militaristic conduct. Just on the GEAR thing, when GEAR was adopted, there was an NEC meeting in Belleville, and I said, I didn't object on its socioeconomic context. I said, this has not been through any ANC structure. And Tito Mboweni said, that's not true. And I think what he was saying, it had been to some grouping within them, but not to us. And we were the leadership. It's supposed to go through the whole leadership. So what happened there is the government took a decision that actually bound government and the ANC. So I was, not for falsely unpacked reasons, I was very upset about this because I was gradually having certain illusions punctured. On the question that you raise, the 80s was a very, very exciting period to be around. When I came out, I was going to go out on an exit permit. That was the normal thing. And we took a decision inside that with P.W. Botha, who everyone thinks is such a reactionary, things have changed and maybe I won't be banned, I must stay in the country. And I was not altogether happy about this because I thought correctly that I would land back in jail again. So at first I was very low-key and I didn't go to the UDF founding. It was only after I gave the T.B. Davey Memorial Lecture on Freedom Charter that I really got very publicly involved. But I was seeing people like you and others before that. And it was a very, very interesting period. We read about the masses in books, but you could really see mass action and mass creativity in practice in the 1980s. The way in which people would use, popular power could be abusive, but it also had situations which were incredibly exciting. And that happened when the structures were representative of the whole community and not just the youth. So it tended to be abusive after the senior leadership was arrested. But you had situations where people would make people's parks. In Port Alfred, they took over the Department of Bantu Administration building, made it into a creche. A whole lot of things like this were happening. They had community mediation efforts because they kicked the police out, to prevent crime. It was a very exciting period to be around. And on the other hand, people were not, because there was a relative freedom, not everyone was preparing themselves adequately for the crackdown when it happened. So when the crackdown happened and some people were arrested, they had not gone through the process I had gone through before to prepare myself for how it would be once one was arrested again. So that some people found it very difficult in that situation. I remember when I was in detention, we got a message that we must have a hunger strike, and a certain friend of Neil and I, and he and I agreed that we must go for 10 days. The maximum was 10 days. Go for 10 days. My reason was, because I'm one of the leadership, I must offer 10 days. Other guy wanted to go for 10 days because he was a bit crazy, I think, you see. And the others got very flaky. It was very interesting because people, even in prison, you have some relative comforts, and you don't want to lose the relative comforts. You get anxious. And I think the UDF had its strengths, but also it's interesting. It would be interesting to know how many of those people are still politicized, are still fired by the same passions, especially amongst the whites. Comrades were not very sensitive to issues of being traumatized, things like this. Someone would come out and then we'd say to him or her, but mainly him, you just go and work in the unions like tomorrow. And people were not given the time. And I realized that there were a lot of people walking around who were suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. I remember someone I worked with to some extent in the ANC headquarters who had behavior that someone from the Western Cape referred to as that chap who's lazy to work. He apparently didn't perform consistently. Seasoned MK guerrilla, all these things. But I think he was just taken straight out of prison, put into structures. In my case, I was tortured, had no counseling for 8 years, came out and still didn't have counseling till after my second time inside. So I think we didn't place weight. Also, when the first emergency occurred, what we call the short emergency, which is about a mere 8 months, at one stage, we were discussing whether detainees should be allowed to see psychologists inside. And we were worried that the rooms would be bugged and that they would tell things that would endanger things. And I remember Muhammad Valley said, once Amos Masunda wants to see a psychologist, then we can reevaluate the situation. Because Masunda was, at that stage, he was just considered like the sort of real example. You know, if you sent him to sent in a jersey to him, immediately give it to someone else. And people would have to say, Ambi, this is for you. And because, say, we're not keen on that. But the second time round, people did go. And it wasn't much use. I also went there, but I went mainly because I was able to, the police took us there, and the black prisoners were there as well. And I was able to talk to them, which was very strange that they allowed this. And so it was not done really, you didn't really get proper counseling over there, but it was useful for political reasons. So that again reinforces the idea that we didn't, like when I came out the second time and I was in a real bad way, I don't think comrades accepted this because they took it that because I held out so long on my own, that, you know, they send messages like, the lawyers told me, they say they don't have to worry about me, you know, like I will be okay. Now, the thing is, they didn't actually accept that I was actually being very, very badly damaged by being in a second time and being in solitary so long. And when I came out, you know, I was, things in that Conference for a Democratic Future, I was writing from house arrest when I was really not in a good shape, but I also myself wanted to just get back straight into it. So, yeah. On the question of the students, you know, I've not been asked to give my advice. You've asked me. But students have not asked me, so I'm very reluctant to offer advice. I think it's one of the tragedies of the rise of a student movement, puncturing myths of equal education and taking a whole lot of directions which, in my view, are not necessarily on course to taking that insight into realizing better universities. Like, I'm not sure how burning libraries contribute towards that, or forcing people out of lecture halls, and various acts of violence, and the celebration of violence. I don't, you know, I think it's very dangerous. But it's also, I relate it to the delegitimization of the liberation movement. People have got no respect for the liberation struggle, for Mandela, for the liberation movement, and they're aided and abetted by some leading commentators, some of the most articulate writers try to demystify Mandela in a way that I think is not accurate. So my advice is very limited. I believe we've got to try to re-establish an intergenerational dialogue. And that is not necessarily with the ANC leadership. It needs, we've got a lot of angry people in the streets. Those people need to be organized, amongst other things, as parent groups who can say to their children, we can't afford you to lose a year in school. You know, it's costing us a lot to have you there. So we need that. I have not got involved in giving this sort of advice because I just think there's too much unsolicited advice. If I were asked to be part of a discussion, for example, on how you decolonize, I ask myself, you know, the people who make the demand have not got the academic knowledge to carry it through. They're making the demand on the people who are the perpetrators of colonial education. So how are they going to achieve this? What do they draw on? Do they know of the scholars in places like Benin on this continent who could help in reconstructing philosophical teaching, say? How do you go about it? And I think we need that sort of discussion. We need people to be open to it on both sides. But since the students, and the student movement is not one, it's a number of different strands, but the most vociferous ones are not open to it. On the last question, Melanie, the notion I'm using is that of connectivity. And I came to it through a dictionary of feminist theology, an essay dictionary, and I followed all the references. You know, there was an entry on connectedness, then there'd be an entry on friendship, entry on relationships, entry on solidarity, a whole lot of these things. Then I got all the books out of UNISA library, and I realized that this is actually the way of explaining betrayal, but it's also the way of explaining adopting. You see, it's more than solidarity that I'm speaking of. Solidarity, you don't go there. Why is it that people go into this space that is so dangerous for themselves in order to join themselves with the oppressed? So I find the notion of connectedness helps, which I see is not peculiar to feminist theology. I also find notions like the ethics of care, which has got obviously got a dangerous possibility of naturalizing women as caring and all of that, but I think the writings around it are very powerful in some ways. So I do think that we need to articulate for people what it means, because it's too often taken, especially in universities, as adopting a radical theory. But what we're talking about is changing your life, to act out a theory in relation to others with whom you join. So I understood myself better after doing that. Brecht says, when I read Das Kapital, I understood my own works better. I understood what I did better when I started to read this literature. On the question of torture, it's not new. I knew from a long time ago that the Brixton police station used to torture people for robbery, things like that. So it's not new. The early political prisoners were beaten up on Robben Island. Even when Mandela arrives there, they threaten them, and he says, I warn you, touch any of us, and I will sue you, and you'll be as poor as a church mouse. Also, they forced them to try to force them to do things against their will. In the beginning, they buried, I think it was Johnson Lambo, in the ground, and one of the warders peed into him. So, you know, there was a lot of bad treatment, also with the white prisoners in the beginning. By the time I got there, they had been tamed, as David Kitson says. In terms of warders, I mean, giving cuts is inherently a very violent thing. And that was a very big part of prison things. There was a warder who was very kind to me, and he told me he came from a prison family, that his father was one of the people who used to give cuts to people. So I agree that it is a problem now, but it was a problem then, and it wasn't unrecognized. It may have been unrecognized in the Bantustans, in the rural areas, not unrecognized by the people there, but unrecognized in terms of public visibility. See, there's a lot in South African history that happens in the back of beyond, where people don't have contact with the ANC officially, but they see themselves as ANC. I wrote about this in my book on the ANC underground. People like Nomboniso's late mother didn't formally get recruited, but they did what they thought the ANC wanted. I hope I covered.
Yeah, well, I'll hear you talk about how you construct your own identity in racial terms or not, because that's a part of
Okay, part of Melanie's.
Yeah.
Okay. The thing about being white in a struggle is you can't say, I see no color. Color is irrelevant to me. It's just as relevant as some ordinary ephemeral matter. You've got to be conscious of being white, especially in above ground political activities. In the UDF, the whites, and to some extent Indians and coloreds, had access to resources that most Africans didn't have access to. At night, after UDF Transvaal meetings, I used to give transport back to Alex, to Paul Mashatile. He didn't have a car. And as they say in the unions as well, Sakela and Buhlungu has written about this, is that the whites knew how to get hold of lawyers, a whole lot of things. And sometimes they used these resources and these ways of access to resources to exercise a power over others. So I was very conscious. People used to mock me in the UDF. Sidney Mufamadi, I remember, used to mock me when they nominated me for something. I would say, no, I think an African comrade should go on to the national, because I was very conscious that the struggle was primarily to relieve the African majority and the working class of their oppression. And it was very important to have the face of the liberation movement primarily black. And it was necessary to step back. And Neil has been doing this for 28 years in COSATU. Step back and let mentor people if they need mentoring. They often don't need mentoring because a lot of people know a tremendous amount without going to universities. People like Walter Sisulu, I mean, one of the wisest people that we've ever known, Moses Kotane, as Joe Matthews said, never set foot in a classroom. And these were giant intellectuals of the liberation movement. But as a white, I had to be aware of the fact that I had certain skills. There were not Walter Sisulus and Moses Kotanes that I interacted with most of the times. I had to find ways of talking, which was not talking down, but would empower others to do what I was doing. I said in the beginning that the book is a journey. I am not complacent. When I say that I've broken ranks and I've explained why I believe I'm right, I'm not believing that I have reached the final understanding of anything. And I think it's very important we must be open to understanding and revisiting things that we've for very long believed in. And that's the part of the lessons of why I was wrong on negotiations, why I was wrong. I've been wrong on quite a few things. But that's what I would like to leave you with. I'd like to leave you with two things. One is I would like to be regarded as an unfinished product, but I'd also not like to be viewed as sometimes people view Mandela as achieving things that is right outside the realm of everyone else's lives. I made a species of difficult choices. Maybe you don't have to pay with prison and torture, but you all make difficult choices. And you have to decide whether you act with integrity or not. And if you want to act with integrity, it may sometimes be difficult. You have to prepare for that. That's all. Thank you.